Today I want to talk about skid plates. Now, unless your bike is going to spend most of its time parked in front of a Starbucks, you're going to need a real skid plate. You never know when you're doing that deep water crossing what lurks beneath the surface. When you're speeding down that trail, sooner or later, you will misjudge the height of a rock and smack into it. And you should also keep in mind that when you land from a little jump or even hit a big depression in the trail, the suspension is going to compress and eat up most of your ground clearance, and you can actually bottom out on a rock that's not that big. Now, when I was shopping for a skid plate when I first got my F800GS, there wasn't a lot of choice on the market, so initially I bought the BMW accessory plate, which I believe is made by Touratech. After it was destroyed, enough time had passed that many companies were making accessories for the F800, and I did some research and settled on the Moto Overland skid plate. Now here you can see three different skid plates. On the left you have the BMW accessory plate. In the center you have the factory plastic plate that comes with the bike, and on the right you have the MOD skid plate. Now just for giggles I weighed them, and the plastic plate weighed 1 pound 4 ounces. The BMW accessory plate was 3 pounds 8 ounces. And the MOD plate came in at quite a bit heavier at 5 pounds 2 ounces. This makes sense because the MOD plate is made out of quite a bit thicker aluminum at 4 millimeters. Now let's take a look at the two metal plates. Forget about the plastic one. You can see both of them offer pretty good coverage. The MOD plate is a little wider and longer, especially towards the rear. Both of them use different mounting systems, and we'll get into that. But once again, good coverage for both. From the front, the wedge shape is evident, which is nice for hopping over or skidding over obstacles. Both plates come up high enough to protect the oil filter, which is down, low, and forward on the F800. Now let's talk about the mounting system. Here you can see the inner mount on the BMW plate, which is this little flimsy stamping, which is held on by 2 rivets on each side, and you can pretty much bend this with your bare hand. This is a shot from the bottom of where the bolt would protrude, and you'd put a nut on it to hold the skid plate on, and those are the 2 rivets once again. Now on the MOD plate, you have the CNC machine bosses that are welded in and are very solid. It really is a beautiful piece of machining and welding. Here we see the oil drain plug from the other side. You don't have to take the plate off to drain the oil, but it is so fast to take this plate off once you have it installed that it's really not worth leaving it on. Now let's take a look at the front mount. The MOD mount is on the left, and it's a pretty substantial piece. And on the right, we see the BMW mount, and that's what it looked like after I gave it a few good whacks, so you can imagine how easy it would be to get that skid plate back on. Here you see the inside of the skid plate, and on the bottom right-hand corner is where the front mount would normally attach, and it's been perforated there and punctured. And you can see the other mount in the center of the image, and it as well is all distorted. Now, not to besmirch the reputation of this BMW product, it did do its job, and I did not punch a hole through the bottom of the engine, but it would get kind of expensive if you had to buy a new skid plate once a season, and since installing the MOD plate, I've hit a lot of other things, and the plate is in perfect shape. Here you see the front mount, which is also held on with 2 supplied bolts. Now don't make the mistake I did and bolt that mount to the skid plate right away. Actually read the supplied directions, and you will see there's a little bit of a technique here. Now if you have an F800GS, if you look underneath the engine after taking off the plastic skid plate, you will see 4 of these rubber mounted bolts. Now be careful with these bolts because there's a bolt that goes into the engine, and there's the bolt piece you see sticking out, and in between is a piece of rubber, and the 2 bolts are not connected. That's what gives you your shock absorption. So don't go crazy tightening those things because you can tear them. If your particular model did not come with a factory skid plate, you won't have those rubber mounting parts, and you'll need to head down to your friendly and reasonably priced BMW parts counter and pick 4 of them up. Now the first step is to peel the sticky paper off the piece of shock absorbing material supplied and line it up with the holes on the front mount and press it into place. I've already installed this skid plate a few times, so my pieces here might not look brand new, but I decided to just go through the process again for the purposes of this video. So here you see the front mount. You install the bracket with the bolt that came from MOD. Now, you have to get the angle of this mount just right. So what we're going to do is install it finger tight, and we're going to press the skid plate up against it, get the angle right, remove the skid plate, and tighten it. And once you've done that process once, you'll never have to do it again. And from that moment on, removing the skid plate literally takes, I think I've timed myself, and it takes under a minute. So now I'm going to hold the skid plate up by lining up the 4 bolts with the 4 holes in the bottom of the plate. And I'm looking in from the side, and I can see the angles not quite right on that front bracket. So I will drop the skid plate and just tilt it a little bit more in the right direction. And now I'm going to just give it a little bit more of a snug so that it won't move once I've got the skid plate back up again. I mean, you only have to go through this process once, because from now on, when you remove the skid plate, that bracket will stay there. Now you can kind of, get your hand in there, give it a little bit of a nudge until it's lying nice and flat up against the bottom of the skid plate, because you want that bracket to be distributing all that load across a wide area. And now it's looking pretty good. Next, I'm just going to tighten the bracket, and for that I'm going to use a socket on one side and a Torx on the other. And of course, I'm holding it here because I don't want it to move out of position, because it's now been adjusted to fit properly with the inside of the skid plate. Now this is the way your bike would normally be if you were just installing the skid plate after an oil change or doing some maintenance, and from here on in it's super easy. So basically you pop the skid plate onto the bottom, and you're going to insert the 4 nuts onto the 4 bolts. And we're going to tighten those up. And as I mentioned before, I'm not going to go crazy. You can see I'm using a very short-handled ratchet here, and you can see how well the thing fits. I mean, once you get those nuts on finger tight, it's not going anywhere, and then it's a very fast process to simply snug those 4 fasteners up. Now the next step is to insert the 2 bolts that secure the skid plate to the front mount. And this is another reason why that front mount has to be properly aligned, because the holes in it have to line up with these 2 holes in the front of the skid plate. And the same thing, these aren't massive bolts that you're pumping in here, so you do not want to go crazy tightening these things. I've found that on these modern bikes with a lot of aluminum parts that you're threading into, I've gotten into the habit of just using a very short-handled ratchet, and then it's much less likely to strip out a fastener. The next thing I wanted to install was the MOD Toolbox. You can see mine here. It comes with a sticker and all the necessary mounting hardware. These are the slots in the front of the skid plate to mount the toolbox. You can see how well the skid plate protects the oil filter, which is behind there. Now you can insert the bolts through the skid plate and have the nuts inside the toolbox, or you can insert the bolts from the toolbox side and have the nuts in, exposed on the skid plate. You can see they're square carriage bolt style bolts, so they won't rotate. You'll only need a wrench on one end. And I decided to put the nuts inside the toolbox so no one could unbolt it. And once you've got the nuts through, there are these rubber washers that are rubber on one side and steel on the other, which help in waterproofing the toolbox. So I pop those on. Now this part is a little easier if you have a second set of hands, even if those hands belong to a 7-year-old. Eventually I figured out that I was just focus on getting one of the bolts in, and then I could pivot up the toolbox, line up the second bolt, and get the washers and nuts all sorted out. The supplied nuts are nylock nuts, so you're not really depending on excessive force to keep it tight. So once again, I didn't go crazy over tightening the fasteners. There are a few options from MOD. I opted to go with the key lock. So then you flip the door closed and turn the key, and it's got a little dirt cover. And here you see the finished product. It's all designed so that even at maximum compression, the front wheel does not hit the toolbox. You can see here it's quite high in terms of hitting rocks or something. It's in a good spot that you'd have to really go out of your way to smash something into this. The old toolbox I had on the front of the BMW plate was actually mounted quite a bit lower and did take a lot of hits. Here you can see that you have access to the drain plug. Always drain it with it on the side stand, otherwise the oil will just kind of fill up the bottom of the skid plate. And here you see the skid plate, and as I mentioned, mine was used, but none of the fasteners stick out, so it really slides well over obstacles, and it doesn't look like it's seen a lot of action, but it's so solid that even with the beating it's taken, it's not all dented and gouged up, which is quite nice. You can see here, there's the catalytic converter. There's this little tail piece that sticks back and protects the cat, and it's thick enough that it's not easily bent if you're sliding over a log or a rock. Here you see the two bolts that are holding on the toolbox, and you're looking down there on the oil filter on the right. It's actually enough room in there that you can probably sneak the filter out without dropping the plate. And to access the toolbox, you flip open the little dust cover, you pop in your key, and there you see. And it's got quite a bit of space in there. Now I will add one caveat to this. It's not submersion proof. If you go U-boat commander on this, you will have to remember to open it up and let whatever's in there dry out. So I keep my tire changing stuff in there. It doesn't really matter if it gets moist. Here you can see the protection on the right side, and it comes up quite high. And here's the left side, and I have the Adventure Spec bars, and above the skid plate you can see the mounting bracket, so it is totally compatible with those and most other bars. Here you see the Adventure Spec mount on the right hand side, so there's plenty of clearance for most bars, and on their website they have a list of all the compatible engine guards. And another shot of the catalytic converter protection. How solid is the skid plate? Well, I've certainly smashed it into a lot of things and it's held up, but even the toolbox is very solid. I went on a ride this spring and we came to this obstacle of a fallen tree, and about 8 guys were lifting over all these little 250s and KTMs and DRs. So when it came time to get the 800 over the log, we stopped halfway and to take a little bit of a rest, and the only thing supporting the bike was the toolbox, which was hooked on that log. After a momentary breather, we lifted the bike down off the log and continued on our way, and I'm happy to say that a year later, I'm still happy with my MOD skid plate and toolbox. And I guess this wraps up another Awesome Players Off-Road Motorcycle Club technical tip. If you like the video, please hit like, Hit the subscribe button too to keep up to date. You can also visit us on our Facebook page or website, and those links are down below. Have a good one.